Hello, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages. I am Rob here in the lair of OmnusI, and we have just finished another night of merry hacking and slashing in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons for my regular group here in my State of the Dungeon address. So these are the shenanigans that went down on the 30th of November 2017. We had all members of the current group in session, although the player, the sorcerer's Geth, did not arrive until later, unfortunately, due to foreseeable circumstances. No problems there. The party was in the process of traveling after they had gotten finished fighting an insane stone giant. The creature was difficult to fight, but they finally overcame it, and they had, using one of the new Bill Webb's deck of Dirty Tricks cards, they had resurrected a dead halfling that they found inside the giant's bag. The halfling turned out to be a former adventurer who now is a sympathetic ally to the party, which worked out. So, they promised that they were going to take a detour and take the halfling back to his homestead. And they set about doing just that. Remember, they are taking this wagon full of obviously saleable goods and weapons that they stole from the elemental cultists of fire, and they're taking it to Womford, which is a city run by piracy and vice, where they could easily sell the weapons, but they're also using it as bait, hoping that some of these cultists come out and attack them to try to claim the weapons themselves. So they followed along the path, and after a day of travel, again, blazing hot temperatures, unnaturally, unseasonably hot in the early third of the spring, everything just to make them as uncomfortable as possible, really. They were traveling along with their wagon understaffed because one of their horses, of the two horse wagon that they were traveling in, was killed by the stone giant in his initial ambush. So the party had to take it very easy with the horse that they had, giving it frequent breaks, helping to push to start up the wagon, and they were under numerous checks because this horse was straining to pull the load. They had a heavily laden wagon. And also, Glob, the goblin, was riding on the wagon periodically because short little goblin legs. So, the party got to the end of the day without any harassment. They bedded down, and in the first watch, which was Terran and Glob watching, a griffin flew down to go after their horse as a random encounter. They were close to the Badlands where these griffins had their eyrie, and it came down to attack the horse, more specifically. So, as they did that, the griffins flew down quietly. They made a stealth roll because they wanted to pounce on the horse, and they rolled a stealth far superior to what the party had for their passive perceptions. So they succeeded at sneaking up and landing next to the horse, which also put them close to Terran. They only saw the first one first. The other one was still flying around, and nobody looked up to see if there were more, so they immediately started to address the griffin in the room. That was, again, going after their horse, and it missed the horse with the first attack. Then Terran demonstrated exactly what a 5th level fighter with Polar Mastery can do. He started buzzsawing through the griffin. 2 attacks plus a butt stroke from the halberd. And at being a battle master, he was also hitting it with distracting strikes so that his next attack would also give him advantage, so that he was almost guaranteeing himself to hit with a chain of attacks. Well, he did a significant amount of damage to the griffin in the first round, and the griffin had to come off the horse to deal with this extremely painful attack coming in from the human. It attacked him but didn't do a great deal of damage. Glob attempted to distract the griffin by using a silent image, creating an image of a lady griffin as best as he could do. The makeup under the eyes was probably a bit much. But, you know, Glob is the GM NPC. He's not there to have brilliant ideas. He's there to have things that set up the rest of the party and entertain the group and stuff. So he tried to distract the griffin, and a griffin suddenly appearing out of nowhere. Certainly, the griffin looked at it, but because it didn't have any scent to it, it was just a plain visual image, it wasn't very distracting. Glob does not have a huge wisdom, so his ideas can be inspirational but not well thought out. So, the rest of the party rolled. Everybody woke up except for Abor, the halfling, or the dwarf paladin of Clangeddon. So I then asked, because I rolled, and the second griffin, the mate of the first one, was going to pounce on somebody who looked carry-offable, and the dwarf certainly qualified, and I rolled for Abor. I thought that would be kind of unfair if he, I asked him, do you want to be a part of this fight? Because he rolled a 1, and then a second 1 for waking up, and initiative was a 1. And he said, sure, I want to be in. And I'm like, okay. So the second griffin, I rolled, and he selected a boar, and it nailed him with both its beak and claw attacks. So he took some damage. Nothing terrible, but he was pinned underneath this griffin that was pecking at him. So the rest of the party very quickly goes and demolishes the male griffin. I believe that Terran used his action surge. He basically burned off all of his mojo fighting this griffin, which would have hurt for him if there had been another encounter in the night, certainly. But he absolutely just deals devastating damage. For those of you who are dungeon mastering and have not seen what a battle master fighter can do, it's pretty extreme when they decide they're going to use all of their maneuver dice in a single round with multiple attacks, especially with an action surge. There's nothing in the rule stopping them from blowing it all at once, and if they do that, they can pile up a lot of dice in a burst. Not enough to keep up with spellcasters throwing fireballs and lightning bolts around. But again, if you aren't expecting it, that burst damage that they're capable of is significant. So he even turned around and he had a butt stroke in on the female griffin to try to drive it off. The rest of the party came in and flung spells, and Orin came in and savagely attacked and did some significant damage to the griffin. But its mate was killed. There were a lot of these humans attacking, and they had magic and stuff. The griffin had had enough, and it took off to go and find another mate and to find more easily taken horses elsewhere. Probably from cultists. So one got away. They decided to butcher the griffin. I had everybody who was interested to find out what's valuable on a griffin roll. Griffins are natural creatures for the world. They don't have highly supernatural components, so their individual parts aren't worth a lot. But, a fussy ranger who wants to be equipped with griffin-fletched feathers for his arrows, griffin feather fletchings for his arrows, sorry, or a wizard who might want the eyes of the griffin. Griffins can see for miles while flying. Use them for eagle sight potions. The blood for, I believe, heroism potions. They're close enough to a lion to do stuff like that. So they took everything they could. The next few watches were spent with Auric plucking feathers. And then the third shift was Glim, the dwarven cleric of Clangeddon, and Abor, the paladin, doing the rest. They rolled well enough that they got everything that was basically of much value besides the meat from the carcass. And in the morning, the halfling, who slept through the whole thing, woke up and said, "Oh, well, do you mind if I take some meat? Because I was a seasoned adventurer. I could turn anything into jerky." They didn't have a problem with it, so he cut off a haunch. And the party continued on their travels. The day was hot, sticky, miserable, more of what they've been dealing with. And, the party it's a slog at this point. Travel is not going to be pleasant as long as this whole issue with the elemental cult is still unresolved. And they know this. So their characters are miserable. They're unable to travel in their heavy armor for fear of exhaustion. The horses they're slowed down to a third of their normal travel speed. So, sorry, by a third. So they're still traveling at 2/3 speed at this point. They also have to carry extra water because everyone's sweating like mad, and so on and so forth. So their wagon is heavily loaded with supplies they need. Then, as I was looking on the map, they were coming close to an ambush that had been preset, but not for them, for another wagon. They had supposedly were to be warned about this ambush so that they could go and save the wagon, and I decided that would be the combat encounter for the night. So I had them come upon the ambush, and they had a fully loaded cart with weapons. They were a target, just the ambush that I had in mind was a bit bigger, and you'll see why. So what they instead ended up fighting were several bandits, 5 of them with bows, a couple of the Crushing Wave Reavers, these are the elemental cultists of water, and a Crushing Wave Priest. The priest initiated things by casting a spell of Crown of Madness upon Auric. Auric has alertness, so he went simultaneously with the priest. If the priest spell had failed, he would have been able to see the ambush. But the priest was camouflaged, he had blur, he made a good saving throw or stealth check. The rest of them, since they weren't doing anything but holding still, had advantage on their stealth checks, and they were all above the passive perceptions of the party. So it would have been an ideal ambush situation, as these guys were planning an ambush, just not the party's wagon, and certainly not with the resources the parties had to bear. But they jumped out and cast Crown of Madness on Auric, who failed his saving throw fairly badly. So Auric moved up stealthily and stabbed Glim in the back, to the tune of quite a bit of damage, probably half of his life in one shot, just about. So that started the festivities. After he did this, Terran, as it turned out, had one of the cards that I'm using, the Phil Webb's deck of Dirty Tricks, which gives players an advantage, a one-shot advantage that they can use sometime in the night. And his card basically said, you are granted surprise on an enemy. Thinking about how he could have surprised the enemy was a little tricky, but I decided that he had had to answer a call of nature. And then as he came back, just as the others were springing the ambush, he came in a perfect vantage to deal with it. So he immediately moved in and ambushed the ambushers. In this case, he took on the Crushing Wave cultists, by far the superior melee fighters. And they were looking to go after the spellcasters. Since at the beginning of the fight, Geth wasn't there, who they would have certainly targeted first. And having melee guys with swords who are devastating against unarmored combatants might have put a crimp in his lightning bolt casting abilities for a little bit. But instead they had to confront an angry Terran, who began tearing them up. That halberd of his is just ridiculous. So the damage that he cranked out to the first one was enough to get him bleeding. The rest of the party then started acting. Glob was kind of caught in a bad situation because he's got high dexterity, he went early. He doesn't have a lot of combat spells. He's left relying on his Finger of Fire, his Firebolt cantrip, for most of the things. But he decided instead he was going to use his second level spell, which is Flaming Sphere, to create a sphere among the archers. Cause them some mischief. So he does that, and a boar went fairly early, and he decided that he was also going to run over and attack the cultists. he loaded up with his thunderous smite, charged over, and whiffed. Unfortunately, his dice were pretty cold in the beginning of the night. So, the group then decided that, for the most part, they concentrated on the cultists and ignored the bandits. The only ones who really paid any attention to the bandits were basically was Glob. Although Auric was kind of right up with a couple of the bandits early on. At first, actually, no, I take it back. Abor was not up against the bandits. Abor was up against the bandits. So he was up by the archers first. The cultists lost control of Auric after another failed attack. After he failed to hit Glim while he was still under the Crown of Madness, and he threw off the effect, which freed up the Crushing Wave Priest to cast spells into the group. He decided that he was going to slow Abor down and let the archers take their toll by casting a Sleet Storm, one of his more powerful spells, on top of Abor. But Abor actually made his saving throw like a champ and got out of the effect. Which, it's not a very large effect. They really kind of nerfed the spell. So, it's only okay. Especially if you've got a bottleneck and you want to... there's situations where it's very effective. Not in this case, however. The cultist that... Abor had basically crushed one cultist. The other cultist had disarmed himself from fumbling and rolling a 1. So, basically, the other archers fanned out, and they were being chased down by the rolling flaming sphere of Glob, which was his major contribution to the fight. The others dropped the two Crushing Wave cultists, the Reavers. They weren't highly effective. They did a little damage because they are fairly decent fighters, but against two dedicated warriors, the ambush kind of worked against them because the targets of opportunity that they really had, the priest and the sorcerer, the sorcerer hadn't shown up and he wasn't really a target. The wizard that they have, Glob, is small and diminutive and not really much of a target. And he never cast any real spells that drew attention to himself, except for little fingers of fire. So, for the most part, the party polished off the cultists, ignored the archers, who scored a few key hits, mostly on Abor. And then they finally sussed out where the wizard was, or what they thought was the wizard, the Crushing Wave Priest, mostly because he sent a volley of magic missiles into Glim, trying to put down the cleric. You always try to finish off the healer if you can. So he fired a volley into him, and that put him in dire straits. One other thing was, this Crushing Wave Priest was actually quite clever. He not only camouflaged himself to be able to maximize casting spells into the group as much as he could, but he also had a ring which allowed him to cast Blur on himself once a day. So once the festivities started, he blurred himself. And then finally, his first spells were indirect, so that it wasn't tied to him. When he started throwing down magic missiles and he had an ice knife he could have thrown, well, then the duplicity was over, but he also ringed himself around with a variety of steel, snap, jaw, bear-style traps. Very nasty ones, too. They also had little runes on the teeth that made them do more damage. So they were a credible threat against 5th level opponents, mostly in that they would immobilize and do a decent amount of damage rated for their levels. So, Abor charges up once he finds out where that spellcaster is. And doesn't check for anything, just charges, and bam, the trap snaps on him. He fails his dexterity save. It gouges him solidly in the leg and does, not an insignificant amount of damage, something like 15 or 16 points of damage. For a 4th level paladin, it hurt. On top of him already having been hit a few times. His first round, while he was in the trap, while he was immobilized, he laid on hands on himself to get himself in a better position. Glim decided he was going to move up and attack, and he He rolled a 1 for his dexterity saving throw. I'm like, well, how bad could it be? He rolled another 1 for his saving throw. I'm like, okay. There's a certain amount of gallows humor and some little bit of bathroom humor that sometimes comes into the game. And I thought, well, what's the worst kind of way that a dwarf running headlong into a trap could do? I didn't want to do something saying that the trap cleanly severed off something. It's a step further than I was willing to take with a basic delay trap. So instead he tripped and fell, and the trap closed upon his lower regions and his thigh, immobilizing him and putting him in incredible pain. So he screamed and coughed a little bit, but he was in a bad way. He was down to single-digit hit points. Auric looked for the traps, and no, he didn't. He trusted to his dexterity to save him, and he ran through the traps, and he successfully made his saving throw, and he got in by the cultist, but the cultist had blur on, and he's hard to hit, so he missed. Terran throws a javelin. Hits him, even through the blurring. Doesn't do a great deal of damage, but starts the process. Claude throws a finger of fire at the cultist. Now everybody knows where he is. And hits the priest for 1 point of damage. Nickels and dimes. So then, the priest is kind of, okay, well, I'm definitely going to drop one of you. So he casts another magic missile, sends 2 into Glim, which puts him out, and starts him bleeding to death, with the intention that he was going to throw another spell and keep doing these magic missiles, throwing 1 more into Glim to kill him finally. And he sent 2 more into Auric, so Auric gets hurt from that. Terran decides he's going to look for the traps. He knows what to look for. He knows where the traps have sprang. So he makes a check just to see if he can see where they are, and he finds them. They're hidden on the ground, but not extremely well. So he darts between the traps safely, and he menaces the cultist as only he really can. And then I believe he might have spent his action surge there, because he walloped the guy, even with his blur up, which meant his attacks were at disadvantage. He laid on about 40 points of damage, almost, in his opening salvo, which really made the cultist think about mortality and how badly he wanted to be there anymore. So his idea was, I'm going to disengage, get away from the fight, do an expeditious retreat spell, which he had to get away from them, which would give him more speed. And that might have worked. With his blur on, he had a chance. One of the things that Terran has is Sentinel, which allows him to attack foes that are trying to leave his attack range. Even using disengage, he can still do it. That might have worked, and he probably would have used one of his tripping maneuver attacks to try to knock him down. However, another one of these wonderful little cards came up. Auric had one that cast confusion on an enemy. And it wasn't casting a spell. They suffer the effects of confusion, which meant, okay, he's confused. So we rolled, and he was forced to attack the nearest opponent with a hand weapon, which was a staff. So he whacks Auric for like 8 points of damage. But he's still a target. Next round, Terran just Cuisinarts him. Dead by a lot. I think, unfortunately, Auric missed again. Glim was down and bleeding. Abor could not free himself from the trap, so it basically fell on Abor and Terran to take down the priest. So once it was done, the priest is dead, cultists are dead. Only one of the bandits survived. He was the one who disarmed himself, and when under cover of Sleetstorm, he slipped away. Nobody really pursued or tracked down where he went. So they were left the victors of the field. So they checked the bodies, and they found a couple of rings that were on the priest, and they found out that his holy symbol was a rather evil bent, more so than its standard holy symbol. And they found a few other nice things on the others, but nothing of any huge value. So they were prepared to leave it at that. They were going to rest because Glim was in a bad way and needed to bind his wounds. Taryn, as it turned out, pulled the trap off of him. And while they were trying to get the trap off of a boar injured himself a little bit more, but they finally got it off. And they bound their wounds. Now, while the Taryn bound his wounds and Glim bound his wounds, the others had a bit of liberty, and I had to make a check. And because they didn't think to look around for a camp or any kind of other information, they just, bandits and encounter, and we're done. Well, a boar ended up finding their camp. And they had tents, they had a crate or a traveling chest full of clothes. He identified that they had enough clothes so that they could hide amongst the populace as sailors or farmers or workers. So they, things for bandits to use when they don't feel like being bandits for a time or want to lure people into a sticky fate. They also had a long, flat chest that was locked with a really nice lock, and there was a bedroll made of rich furs and fabric. Well, a boar found this, and he's like, "Oh, I'm not telling anybody else what's here." Very paladin-like. He saw the chest, the trunk, and he looked through it and saw all these different clothes. He was like, "Oh, okay, that's what these cultists were doing." Then he looked at the long, locked, flat chest. And he decides, I'm going to take my axe, I'm going to smash it. So he does. He hits it. What he doesn't know is that it's filled with alchemist fire. And when it's all under pressure like that, the exploding heat and everything from these bottles opening up caused the entire thing to explode, and that force to hit him right in the face. He made a saving throw against the devastating fire blast, but he was critically injured and flung up against a tree. Not killed. He still had like 7 hit points, but I think he was probably in really good shape, to that far, he took a massive amount of damage. So he's picking himself up while the others all rush in. Of course, the scene is devastation. The tents have burned up. The chest is burned up. The clothes have burned up. They got to see the remains of the chest that he hit with the axe. There's not much left. They could only tell that there was alchemist fire inside, and it's consumed just about everything. And the furs were scorched. Not burned up, but scorched. So they put out a boar, scolded a boar, rolled off of a boar. I don't think he learned anything. They shook their heads, counted what they'd lost, and went back to the camp and decided they were going to head out. So they travel on, and relatively quickly, after several hours of travel, they come across a large caravan. 8 wagons in full, including one brightly painted one in the front, being led by 2 knights in full armor and plate and shields and lances. Not as useful in those countryside where they were, but just the presence of them there was probably going to be enough to discourage almost any attack. The group goes up and they end up meeting them. They meet the caravan leader, Happy Harvald, who wears bright yellow clothes, a bright green sash across his belt that has gold dollar signs printed on it, and the character that I took was basically a blend of Billy Crystal's Miracle Max from A Princess Bride and Yogurt, as played, of course, by in the show Spaceballs, by Mel Brooks. Thank you. And smashed those two together and kind of made the super merchant. who was so happy to see them and was so deliriously happy to have adventurers who might be interested in buying the goods that he had. And he was talking like this, and oh, I'm so happy to see you. You must come and buy from me. Well, what I didn't realize was exactly how hard up the players were. Several of the characters didn't even have a gold piece to their name, just some electrum, some silver, and some copper. The one who had hoarded his money and was Terran, who didn't really need a lot. He already has decent armor and the weapon of his choice. So I was kind of left in a difficult situation because this merchant really wanted to trade with him. He had some secrets, but his ulterior motive was he wants to help the adventurers in the region to fix the region, which includes the party, who are already marked as enemies of the elemental cult. So he starts cutting them a deal. He buys up anything that they have of any value that they can't get rid of. Griffin parts? Sure, he'll give you 500 gold. Then they're like, we have other things to sell them. He bought the wagon full of goods. They really didn't want to be merchants all that badly. So he was willing to give them 500 gold in credit, which is going towards buying a new adamantine halberd for Terran. He basically set up the caravan, so the money was effectively his. And the group kind of started, deciding what they were going to do. The paladin decided that since he was getting hit so much and this polearm weaponry was good, but he's decided now he wants to change to using a flail and a shield. They found a flail. The flail has 2 runes on it, each of which can cause a massive explosion that the wielder is not immune from. So it's basically got 2 one-shot weapons that could possibly go off at the same time with a good hit. So, well, they found some other nice items. They found a greatsword +1, an actual magical weapon. I've only given out 2 so far. They found a lot of other items that have some magic to them, but they're not magical, having a +1. They found a scimitar of swimming that doesn't give a bonus to hit, but it allows anybody who carry it to almost have no chance of drowning. They found a ring, black metal. It was a ring of truth. When activated for 1 minute, anybody within 60 feet of the wearer of the ring who lies finds disgusting things falling out of their mouths, like serpents and eels and worms. They found boots that allow the person, if they're perceived by somebody of lizard kind or dragon kind, to appear themselves lizardish or draconic. Lizard man for viewing by lizard man, dragonborn for those who are dragonborn, of the appropriate color to make them happy. So it was kind of a diplomatic type item that the party didn't care about. And they also found what was the jade? They found a jade ring. That's what casts blur. Once per day for 1 minute, not requiring any concentration. It's powered by the ring. The wearer can cast blur on themselves. They found a few other interesting little relics. Poor Glob was having to down pearls to do the identify spells, and it's so nice. They have these moments where they role play and they can actually be considerate. They're like, oh, you really don't like swallowing those pearls? He's like, they're big and I got a little throat. And they're like, well, can we crush it up? And Gath is like, I've got some wine here, that'll help it go down. And he's like, oh, I love you guys. You guys are so nice. Despite the fact the dwarves are constantly talking about trading him off or banishing him from the group. So he identifies their things, and they turn around and they're like, well, we really don't need this ring of truth. It's not going to do us any good. But Terran's player comes up with an interesting idea. He's like, if we give this to the merchant and ask for a cut of any profits that he makes that are better because he has this ring of truth, and he can suss out if somebody's lying to him, we might be able to make a tidy little profit in excess of what he'd be willing to give us initially, which is true. Not in the way that he thinks, but there will be a payoff to this. And the merchant thought it was a good idea. A boar claimed the greatsword +1. And the party had a very clever way of dealing with the jade ring. Taryn's idea, again, is like, okay, everybody bid for it with money that you got in your pocket. Whoever gets it, whoever has the most money at the moment, and I'm not going to bid even though I have the most money, but whoever has the most money gives that money up and it gets split among the group. That way, if the next item that comes up is something you want, that person probably doesn't have any money left and the rest of the people have whatever money is left over to bid. That's actually really clever. I like it as a concept. Throwing it out in the middle of a group and running on an adventure is kind of odd, but it's a novel idea and I like it. I certainly wish there were other times when we would have done something like that. It gets rid of the arbitrariness of trying to identify the exact cost of a magical item and then subtracting that from a person's share. I don't know. I'll think it over. It's actually good on-the-spot thinking. It's a good mechanism. I like it. So, for 75 gold, Geth ended up with the ring. But Abor ended up with a great sword +1, and he went to the merchant, who is now Happy Heimdall. Doesn't seem to have the same name, except that it begins with an H. I don't think they caught that. Oh well, I don't mind revealing it. And he's like, can I trade this for a magical flail? I'd rather have a flail. And she's like, well, sure I can. Bear in mind, too, their initial encounter, Abor let his 14-year-old player's mouth run a bit much and said some kind of stupid things, like asking for magical items but only having 20 gold to his name, and just doing things that normal merchants would just... So finally he's like, look, when a grown-up wants to talk for you, you let them know, but I'm not dealing with you anymore. And the others kind of worked around that because he was kind of being a little obnoxious. A lot of rolled eyes that night. So he's like, can we trade this? And he's like, all right, I'll tell you what. I do have a magical flail, but it doesn't look all that impressive. But it is a weapon that you'd like. He's like, okay. It was owned by a peasant hero who, when standing up against an entire horde, keeping his villages safe, he fought off a horde of bugbears and ogres with nothing more than several layers of sweaters and this. And it's a stick with a rope nailed to it and 2 heads, which are just basically blocks with a bunch of spikes poked through them. And at first he looks at it as like, this is a joke. You're putting me on. But Glob cast Detect Magic, and sure enough, it's radiating magic, a pure white light. And he's like, this was blessed by good gods for this warrior sacrifice. He's a peasant hero, and this is kind of like a relic. So they did the trade. He has a skeezy-looking weapon. Nothing that most warriors would be proud of carrying, but it's actually a +1 flail. Throat medicine. I need it. I'm coming down with a cold. So, the party gets to trade the things that they don't want. He does go for the gold exchange. And eventually, after, a lot of thank yous and farewells and stuff, the party ends up doing pretty well for themselves. They eventually break up. The wagon carries on, but it promises them that it's going around the valley because this is a place of troubles and this is where a merchant of his nature is needed for profit. The group keeps going, and they eventually take the halfling to his home. There's a bit of travel, couple of days, but no major encounters of any sort, really. Just them being miserable because of the weather. And eventually they come to the homestead, which was clearly made by humans. The scale is bigger than the halflings. But they get there, and there's his wife, who is a little bit older but nice, and she's happy to see him. And 15 of his kids come pouring out and go running up to see their father. And his wife is mad at him because he went running off with some adventures. He's like, no, I was going on business, and I got killed by a stone giant, and these people saved me. So they were guests. So they were brought in with a promise of food and shelter for the night. And the halfling brought them up to his study, and he was a former adventurer, and he honestly was. I don't think they were expecting anything as a result. And so he's like, all right, well, as I said, I was successful, and I'll give you a few of the things that got me there. So he gave each of them a +1 dagger. So now they all have some means of defending themselves against evil creatures that can only be hit by magical weapons. And they're alchemical silver. So lycanthropes beware. They have daggers. Because Auric was the person who brought him back from the dead, he gave him a set of mithril masterwork thieves' tools, so he gets advantage whenever he uses his thieves' tools for traps and locks, which is nice. He gave them a ring of false life, which they've decided to give to Glob. He can use it, and it really doesn't hurt for him to have it. He's small and can easily zap people with it and keep them upright in battles. But he's going to stick close to the side of his buddy Terran or Auric, who Auric seems to like Glob a bit. So he knows who likes him, and will respond in kind. And Glob also proved useful earlier, too. The horse threw a shoe and was lame, but Clerical Healing healed the hoof. They couldn't replace the shoe easily, so Glob told them to make a horseshoe out of wood, which they successfully did, and then he used his minor alchemy to transform it into steel, and just kept doing that enough for them to get by. And basically that was the night. They got some nice things. Their looting skills are a little rusty. They left some stuff on the table. There's some party disharmony. I think some of the party is kind of getting tired of some resources being lost here and there from foolish mistakes. It'll be interesting to see the characters grow and learn from these mistakes. But they have a new ally. Oh, and they were also given a map to the Hall of the Hunting Axe, which is the last resting place of one of the great Thanes who belonged to the clan that used to rule this valley. So it'll be a good quest for them, and they decided they want to go straight there and make sure that the cultists don't get there first to loot the place. They want to, of course, use anything they find there to help them out. And that's where we ended up. So group got a bunch of experience. Not a huge amount of fighting, but the group now has as many goods as they, probably needed. They did take some of the money. They upgraded Glim and Abor's armor, so now they're clad in splint mail, I think. Step up from chainmail. So they're better protected. Now Abor has a shield. Now he's fighting with a mace or a flail and shield, so he's better protected. He's got an armor class all the way up to 19. And the group is pretty well provisioned, so it'll be a good dungeon, possibly a dungeon crawl next time. We'll see how it goes. I am Rob, here in the lair of OmnusI. That is my State of the Dungeon address, and I bid you safe adventures. Thank you. Farewell.